This time it's 5 amazing sports 250s. The quarter-litre class has always been one of my favourite categories of motorcycle. I think it's a very useful capacity that can do most things. Of course, today, when people speak of sports bikes, they're generally always thinking about 1 litre plus sports bikes because people have become very capacity obsessed. But it wasn't always so. And in fact, the quarter-litre class can make some of the most exciting and indeed enjoyable to ride sports bikes that are available. So here are 5 classic sports 250s. The ALIA RS250. For a company as well known for its Grand Prix success in 250 and 125 classes as ALIA, it was fairly obvious that at some point they were going to make a 250. The company, of course, already made the RS125. And so in 1995, ALIA introduced their RS250. The machine in many ways mimics their Grand Prix races with its cast aluminium frame and very sporting styling, which is extremely aerodynamic and clearly very close to their original Grand Prix bikes, in general appearance at least. But of course, while the Grand Prix races would use a Rotax based engine, the road bike would make use of Suzuki's V-twin from the RGV250. And of course, ALIA would claim to have tuned the machine to gain a very optimistic 70 horsepower. The truth is that the back wheel you're actually getting around 55, but that's still an awful lot in such a lightweight machine. The Suzuki engine was a 90-degree V-twin 2-stroke with a bore stroke of 54 by 54.5. Peak power was at a heady 11,000 RPM, which all added up to a very rapid 250 indeed. The handling and the styling was streets ahead of the Suzuki from which the engine was derived, and this was an absolute classic of a bike, and something of a rarity today. Honda NSR 250. Like ALIA, Honda lay claim to a great history of success in the 250 class in Grand Prix, and this would of course, again like ALIA, stimulate them to produce a road version, with the road-going NSR being produced between 1987 and 1989 in various formats. Like the ALIA, the chassis was generally very race-based, and the handling of this bike is quite extraordinary. Speaking from experience, I owned one of these for a couple of years. And that 90-degree V-twin shared the same bore and stroke as the Suzuki motor, although in the Japanese market form it was actually restricted to 45 horsepower. But that shouldn't put you off. Even in restricted form, this bike is a real mover, and is without a doubt the best handling motorcycle I have ever ridden. Absolutely astonishing. And even better, in unrestricted form, the bike makes a full-on 57 horsepower. And interestingly, Honda would go their own way in terms of technology. They didn't use a power valve like everybody else in the exhaust, because that would get sooted up. Instead, they had a system which adjusted the length of the inlet tract, basically producing the same effect. And I can testify that that system is incredibly effective, and we found that this humble 250 2-stroke had a fatter mid-range than the 400 4-stroke 4-cylinder bikes that we'd had previously, and a feeling which I think is amplified by the fact that the bike is incredibly light, and indeed it's lighter than many modern 4-stroke 125s. Okay, say comfortable and practical it wasn't, but this was a fantastic sports machine, and would run until 1999 when production ended. Suzuki RGV250. Suzuki's RGV250 was introduced in 1987 as a replacement for the outgoing 250 Gamma model. And while the old Gamma model had a perimeter frame and a parallel to an engine, the new bike would be much more Grand Prix influenced, with an aluminium beam frame and a 90-degree V-twin engine, which of course was also later shared with the ALIA RS. Unlike the Honda, the Japanese market version would be restricted to 45 horsepower, but the full-blooded export version would claim 60 horsepower plus. Although all this power was of course very high at the rev range and in a very narrow band between 8,000 and 11,000 RPM, with very little going on below that. With a lightweight around the 130 kilogram mark, the machine handled of course exceptionally, and acceleration was blistering in unrestricted form, with 0 to 60 coming up in just 3.7 seconds. Cracks in the power valve system were reported on some early models, but but this was corrected by a later redesign, and in general the bike is fairly tough, although it has to be said the bike does get a good sound thrashing, particularly when used on track days, a job for which the bike is particularly well suited, because the Suzuki is perhaps the ultimate hooligan 250. The Yamaha FZR250. The FZR250 is a great example of the kind of bizarre machines that Japanese licensing laws can create, because it meets the 45 horsepower limit for 250s, but it's actually a 4-cylinder 4-stroke, and one that amazingly redlines at 18,500 RPM, although it can actually hit the rev limiter at nearer the 20,000 RPM mark. Yamaha introduced the bike in 1986, and it used a 4-stroke transverse 4-cylinder engine with direct overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder of 249 cc's with a bore and stroke of 48 by 34.5, so those pistons were absolutely minute, which of course is how the engine managed to rev so high. Peak power was 45 horsepower at 14,500 RPM, although the engine would continue producing power way beyond that, and this was then fed through a 6-speed gearbox to give the machine a top speed of around the 120 miles an hour mark, although the weight of the rider would vary this considerably. There's no doubt this class of machine provides a truly unique experience. Imagine driving at 70 miles an hour at 10,500 RPM. Absolutely amazing pieces of kit. And with those tiny internals, surprisingly robust too. The Kawasaki KR1S. Kawasaki's KR1 and KR1S were produced between 1988 and 1992, of course as a Japanese domestic market product, but also sold as a full power version in other markets too. The machine is perhaps of an earlier generation than some of the bikes featured in the video today, because it's a parallel twin 2-stroke, although it does have an aluminium beam frame of course. The little water-cooled 2-stroke engine uses 180-degree crank spacings, has reed valve induction and Kawasaki's power valve system in the exhaust. Kawasaki would claim a peak power of 60 horsepower, and in fact on test it proved to be the fastest 250 on the market, including the Aprilia RS250, hitting a top speed of 139 miles an hour in a group test performed by Performance magazine. However, the KR1S has never been as popular as the V-twin opposition. Its parallel twin engine is not as smooth as the V-twins, nor is the chassis as good, and is prone to head shakes when really pushed hard. As a consequence, the KR1S is the poorest selling of all the Japanese 2-stroke 250s of the period, with less than 10,000 units actually being produced. But make no mistake, the KR1 is a real mover, and with a dry weight of just 123 kilos, the bike really accelerates off the corners. Now, my uncle owned one of these and used it for track days and said that it was absolutely fantastic for the job. And while the chassis may not be up to the levels of say the NSR 250, that doesn't mean it's not good, because it's very good. And if you get the KR1S model, it produces a full 65 horsepower, which is why the machine at Bonneville Salt Flats set a record for the world's fastest production 250cc motorcycle. Today the KR1 is something of a collector's item, largely because of the relative rarity, courtesy of those poor sales figures. The KR1S is not as highly regarded as some of the other 250s mentioned here, but that doesn't mean it should be overlooked. This is an absolutely cracking bike, and one that would definitely not disappoint. What collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.